Before seminary, I worked for several years in the convention and trade show industry. And the first thing you learn working there is for every interest group, for every denomination, for every enthusiast, there's a convention. For virtually every kind of trade, there's a trade show. So it did not strike me as especially unusual a couple years ago when I found myself in Denver at the Festival of Homiletics. This is a preaching convention. That's right, there are big preaching fans out there. They go many miles in order to sit through several services a day just to listen to some of the best preachers in the whole country. So I went to one of these services. I got there early to get a good seat like all you did. And I started chatting with the lady who was sitting next to me. Now, she was from one of those square states in the middle that I have never been to. And we began chatting, and she said, "So what denomination?" I said, "Well, I'm a UU. I have never met a Unitarian in person before. I didn't know how to react to that because typically I'm surrounded by them. And from her reaction, I wasn't sure if she was going to try and baptize me or ask for my autograph. But it's true, Unitarians are not the largest denomination. We're certainly not the most well-known denomination in the country. But during the time of the founding of this country, we were everywhere. You couldn't shake a stick without seeing a Unitarian. But it's uncanny. There's always people who arrive here and say, "You know what? I've been a Unitarian all my life. I just didn't know it." And some of them say they were really annoyed that nobody ever told them about it sooner. So like the lady I met in Denver, many people want to know more about Unitarian Universalism, even, or perhaps especially, new UUs. I found that at the church I served in Sacramento, many people joined because they loved the ministers, they loved the service, they loved the social justice work the church was doing. They immediately felt at home there. Some began attending the election, after the election, sensing a real need to be with like-minded people. But many knew very little about the history of Unitarian Universalism, or even what it looked like outside their congregation. They appreciated it when I would slip in a little bit of Unitarian history into my sermons. So today I'm talking about the Unitarian side of our faith, much like Aaron spoke about the Universalist side last week. So as I thought about what Universalism is like, I wondered about the best way to describe who we are. I realized it revolves around the fact that we're a covenantal, not a creedal faith tradition. This means relationships are central to what we do. Our relationship to that which is greater than ourselves, and our relationships to one another. We are quick to say that we agree on how we're going to treat one another, not agree that we believe the exact same thing. The last line in the essay I read earlier is, "I have come to realize that our covenant with one another is guided more by common values than by common beliefs." Our affirmation this morning describes things we covenant with one another to do. Did you notice all the words describing actions? Service, dwell, seek, serve. And all these to the end that all souls shall grow in harmony with the divine. I also realize that our theological ancestors seem to always be butting up against rules they didn't agree with. We're prone to break them, and those who made the rules would treat the rule breakers horribly, which is probably why we came to believe that treating people right is more important than insisting you're right. So if I had to subtitle this morning's sermon, it might be Relationships and Rules, or maybe even Relationships Rule. I began attending church after not going for many years because I knew the value of a faith community and wanted to be a part of one. I missed those relationships. I grew up Methodist, but had known for some time when I started going back to church, I would check out Unitarian Universalism. I imagine people assume I began attending here because of the church's progressive stand on GLBT rights. But for me, that was just icing on the cake. I always had a problem with the idea that there was only one right way to conceive of God, one right way to do religion, and boy, howdy, wasn't I lucky to have been born in the perfect time and place in history to be born into a family that was part of that one correct way. No, there were too many people born in different times and different places who weren't privy to this information. And plenty of them probably thought they were the ones who were right. The UU's conviction that wisdom can be found in many faith traditions initially led me here. The longer I stayed, the more I learned and the more I liked. Early Unitarians, and those we often claim as our theological ancestors, all had this one thing in common. They questioned if someone else could decide what God is like and then dictate that beliefs to others. Back then, it was usually in a Christian context, and it began when Constantine decided to get everyone on the same page about God and Jesus at the Council of Nicaea. The Trinity was narrowly voted in as the way God is, and that became the new rule. Jump ahead to the early 1800s in Boston, where many preachers were enforcing John Calvin's rules that, among other things, said people are depraved, and the triune God knows who is saved even before they are born. Other preachers who eventually accepted the label Unitarian said, and I paraphrase, "Wait just a cotton-picking minute, we don't think that's what God is like." William Ellery Channing, who has lent his name to many a fellowship hall, was one of Unitarianism's leading theologians in the early 1800s and the foremost Unitarian preacher. He preached a sermon entitled Unitarian Christianity, claiming the Trinity to be both illogical and unscriptural. Channing said, and again I'm paraphrasing, God cannot be 100% as well as 33 1/3. Also, Jesus cannot be both 100% human and 100% God. And the Calvinists replied, and again I paraphrase, "We have rules. Who said you could use math to figure out what God is like?" Then Ralph Waldo Emerson said, and this isn't a paraphrase, "Why should we not enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have poetry and philosophy and insight and not of tradition and religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? The sun shines also today. Let us demand our own words and law and worship." Then the Transcendentalists said, "You don't know the half of it." We also think people can use their intuition to sense what is holy. So you can imagine how well all this went over in 19th century New England with the ancestors of Calvinist Puritans. So the point of all this is to say, like our theological ancestors, we embrace the notion that God, the divine, the spirit of life, is too complex an entity and concept to insist on only one name, interpretation, or metaphor. There can't be a rule that says God is a particular way. It's too complex for one human brain or even one faith tradition to understand the entirety of the divine, which is why you often hear our prayers begin with, God of many names. Today, our belief that God is beyond our understanding and descriptive powers goes beyond a Christian context to the knowledge that people experience the divine through a variety of faith traditions, using many types of imagery, and some people experience that which is larger and beyond our understanding without using any God language at all. We want your concept of the divine to be that which empowers you to do the most good for the most people in this world. Treating people right is more important than insisting you're right. Which leads directly into the other relationship central to who we are, relationships with one another and those who share our planet. But I have to admit, growing up, it took me a while to realize that relationships take precedence over arbitrary rules. I grew up as what my ex describes as Ozzie and Harriet as painted by Norman Rockwell. Back then, I assumed that those in authority no doubt were carefully vetted and possessed the wisdom, knowledge, and leadership skills to be in their position. Of course, as I now know, this isn't always true, although it sometimes is, as I often tell my stepchildren. Years ago, in an earlier incarnation of our small group ministry here at church, I remember someone telling a story very, very similar to mine. His realization that he was gay, and knowing that what was said by many churches about gays was patently false, he began to wonder what else that was being said by those in authority was not true. I had the same realization, and without it, I very well might have continued on, prone to sticking to the rules as presented to me. Being here, I have seen examples of those who used their reason and intuition to do the right thing, because the relationship is more important than arbitrary rules. No less a figure than Thomas Jefferson said, "If a law is unjust, a man is not only right to disobey it, he is obligated to do so." This struggle is well exemplified by what went on with the Unitarians in Boston in the mid-1800s. As part of the Compromise of 1850, the U.S. Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Law. The law not only provided for the return of fugitive slaves to their masters in the South, but also required private citizens in the North to assist in their capture. And many Bostonians, some of them Unitarians, believed they had to follow the law because it was the law, even though they disapproved of slavery. They put the rules before their relationship to their fellow human beings. Well, abolitionists in Boston immediately began organizing resistance to the law. Unitarian minister Theodore Parker was one of the founders of a vigilance committee, which included blacks as well as whites, and was designed to protect, quote, "the colored inhabitants of Boston from any invasion of their rights," end quote. Parker wrote an angry letter to President Fillmore, and he made it clear that he would obey the laws of God, even if it meant breaking the laws of men. So, here we have it. The relationship between Parker and others in his community, some of them his congregants, some of them fugitive slaves. He manifested his relationship with the divine as a guide to do the right thing. Because if a law is unjust, people are not only right to disobey it, they are obligated to do so. We not only look to our theological ancestors for the guidance and strength to do the right thing, we can see in their lives the difficulty of doing so. Looking back at only people who did the right thing without vacillating or without consequences makes our struggling with decisions seem more difficult than theirs. But it isn't. William Ellery Channing, whom I mentioned earlier, has been referred to as a reluctant radical. While he loved peace and helped organize opposition to the War of 1812, he also hesitated to speak out against slavery. He was eventually persuaded to do so by his abolitionist friends, but that alienated him from the wealthy congregation he had served for decades. Doing the right thing can be difficult. Many are shocked to learn that during the civil rights struggles of the 60s, only 13% of even black churches supported Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many churches feared or were otherwise intimidated from showing support of his movement. However, UU minister James Reeb and UU activist Viola Liuzzo were both murdered in Selma working to obtain voting rights for everyone. Doing the right thing can be dangerous. Of course, it's easier in hindsight to know that you're on the right side of history. But reflecting on your relationship to the divine, thinking about your relationship to others sharing our planet, especially the more vulnerable, learning about these ancestors who stepped up and worked for justice against formidable odds, inspires us to do the right thing in ways that blindly following rules cannot. You may have seen a meme on social media by New York lawyer and activist Aditi Juniha. She tells us, if you've wondered what you would have done during slavery, the Holocaust, or the Civil Rights Movement, you're doing it now. Our Unitarian heritage leads us to reject the limiting definitions of the divine prescribed by those who came before, or those today with the loudest voices. We proudly use our intuition, our intellect, and loving kindness to nurture our relationships with the holy, with one another, and with all those with whom we share the planet. Because of those relationships, and inspired by those who came before us, we are Unitarian Universalists, a community in covenant that works for healing and justice in this world. Amen.